Hello, friends and fellow workers. It is Tuesday, June 2nd in the year 2020. I'm David Rovix, and during the time I've been unable to travel and play music for a living like I did before the pandemic hit, and I had to cancel all my tours, I have taken the time to start up a 5-day-a-week live stream broadcasting habit. On Mondays, I host a weekly open mic. Wednesday through Friday, I interview various artists and activists and other folks in a series called Discussions with David. And starting last week, on Tuesdays, I host Fifth Estate Live, a collaborative effort between me and producer of the show, Peter Werby, founding editor of the Fifth Estate magazine and longtime Detroit area talk show host. All of these broadcasts go out live at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT every weekday, and they're currently being live streamed on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cable Community Radio, and on various other platforms, including at davidrovix.com/quarantine. All the live streamed broadcasts also go out in podcast form afterwards. If you don't want to miss any episodes, subscribe to This Week with David Rovix on the podcasting platform of your choice. If anyone has ideas about other social media platforms from which we might broadcast live, I'd love to hear from you about that or anything else. Today's guest for the second edition of Fifth Estate Live is Clayton J. Pyke, who I believe is speaking to us from somewhere on the West Coast. The most recent print edition of the Fifth Estate was all put together before the pandemic hit, but in light of some of the recent events, particularly of the past few days, with the very wide variety of different actors involved with the ongoing unrest currently taking place across the United States, Clayton Pyke's article in the paper is as relevant as ever. Seeing is Obeying: Authoritarian Aesthetics and the Afterlife of Fascism in Neoliberal Democracy. Clay, welcome to Fifth Estate Live. First of all, can I ask you what your life has been like over the past few days? Normally a fairly droll question, but at the moment it's, I think, of quite a lot of interest.
My life. Well, first of all, David, I just want to say thank you for having me, and thank you to Peter Werby and the rest of the folks at the Fifth Estate Editorial Collective. Y'all are some wonderful folks. I'm really glad to be here, being interviewed by you, David. Literally the day before I got the email asking me to appear for the interview, I was listening to Democrats Make Me Want to Vomit in the car. And it was just really fantastic to hear that I would be being interviewed by someone whose music and art I've appreciated for as long as I have.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you. To get to your question, it's almost impossible to answer without it sounding just ridiculously short of the mark and anticlimactic. It's been, I guess I'll just say, active. It's been very busy. It's been extremely extemporaneous. And it's been an adjustment trying to calibrate yourself to the tempo of that unrest that you were talking about in your introductory comments, especially given that prior to the murder of George Floyd and the murder of other folks in the course of the actions that have happened and things of that nature, we being some friends of mine and I, were working on a mutual aid project, doing curbside distributions of goods, doing mobile distributions of goods, and all of that is still continuing, even as the protest actions are continuing. So the conversation has been, about pivoting that mutual aid work to not only, continue the work in the community that we've been doing, but also to make sure that we are there to provide aid to our friends on the front lines and demonstrations and in actions as well. So they're safe, they're secure, and they're as well taken care of as they possibly can be.
In terms of mutual aid projects going on here in Portland, someone who was at the protest in Laurelhurst Park the other day said that some folks had set up a food table for free food, and they called it the snack block. I thought that.
No, yeah, I like that. That's clever. Yeah,
What's been the mutual aid situation like where you are? Is there, and you've been hearing much about other mutual aid projects? I mean, this has been going on. A lot of mutual aid projects have been going on since the pandemic and the lockdown and quarantine, and so many people have been going short on food. And
Sure.
and then what, I don't know if there's been much in the way of rent strike organizing in your circles, but can you just tell us something about mutual aid projects that have been happening?
Sure, sure. So I work with a couple of different formations. One is the Bridgetown Collective that runs a DIY space in La Puente. That's kind of a hub for people all over California as well as all over the US, bands who are on tour, things of that nature, come to shows. So we've been doing curbside distributions there in collaboration with another project I'm a part of called 714 Mutual Aid, which is the organization that I mentioned previously. We've been doing curbside distributions of goods. We've been doing mobile distributions of goods. We've been providing, at this point now, we're working on providing bail and jail support. And the project itself is still ongoing in terms of what our goals are. So, for example, we're planning on having a kind of story time YouTube channel where we broadcast themed, sort of radical or progressive books that are paired with activities for children of all ages, providing for soft needs, people who want to draw, paint, craft. That's in distribution packets as well. So, we are one of a handful of projects that started, as early on as we possibly could. It was really interesting. I don't know if this was the case where you were or what you've been hearing from other people, David, but it was almost as if there was this sort of phase where it was like, what do we do, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do we mean to do what we do in the midst of a global health crisis where you have shelter-in-place restrictions and things of that nature, and you do have people who are very much at risk in a lot of ways for contracting this very horrible illness. So 714 Mutual Aid emerged out of that, and we work with several other organizations and projects, are actively trying to build relationships with them to continue to expand our efforts so that, optimally, crises will, at least this crisis will go away. But of course, we know the manifold crises of capitalism never stop. So we would much like to establish, something that is permanent, that has longevity and resilience, so that in the event that something of this magnitude, in this case, I'm referring to COVID, happens again, right? We are prepared with infrastructure to support our community and our friends.
And what 714 Mutual Aid? Where can people find out? Like, there's the YouTube page, the YouTube channel you mentioned. I don't know.
No, the YouTube. We're actually in conversations with video production folks about how to get that around. That's sort of in the works. Mm-hmm. You can follow us on Instagram at 714 Mutual Aid. We have a website, 714mutualaid.org. We can be reached directly at 714mutualaid@gmail.com. So those are probably the easiest ways for folks to get a hold of us. There is also a hotline that folks can call if they've got concerns, questions, or if there's a particularly pressing need. And that phone number is going to be 714-312-6622. So those are all of the sort of easiest ways for folks to get in touch with us. We're also on Facebook, so like us, follow us there. And if folks want to donate, we have a Venmo and a Cash App available as well.
Are you under the impression that there are other mutual aid projects, or a lot of other mutual aid projects that are as well organized as yours, as that one, with all the different contact info and stuff? Because it strikes me as very helpful to actually have that level of organization, although it's some work.
Well, I appreciate the compliment paid to myself and my friends and the project. I'm very, very grateful to be working with fantastic people doing such meaningful stuff. I will say that, different mutual aid projects are responding to, although there are kind of at a high enough or a sort of meta enough level, right, shared needs that we're recognizing across projects. These projects develop in their own ways, given where needs are, how people want to respond to them, what resources they have, and all of that. So I think that, people are still in the process of trying to figure things out. I think that regardless of whether or not they have, the level of organization or whatever we want to call it that some other projects do, they are still nonetheless all doing meaningful work. I mean, they really, really are.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really fantastic. And that's the important thing, making sure that you are in the community, responding to the community, and helping the community help itself. And I think they're all doing that.
Yeah, and not just doing it from entirely from your living room, which is one of the bigger challenges of this current historical moment, perhaps. But
Oh, it absolutely is. But I will say that once again, there are many ways of doing the work, and there is so much work that needs to be done. There are folks who have to social distance and take that a bit more seriously because they're in the healthcare professions. They know people who are. They're in one or more risk categories, and there are still ways for those folks to get involved. And honestly, that social media presence is so crucial, and networking online is so crucial, especially now in a post-COVID world. Although we're not post-COVID, we're in COVID.
mhm.
In a COVID world, right? That I think it's very, very possible for folks of various personal capacities to be meaningfully engaged in mutual aid work and organizing in general.
Clay, in the article that you wrote in the most recent Fifth Estate, it's very interesting, and you talk about the aesthetics of fascism and the style and style versus content and
Right.
presentation. And I know you've done a lot of research into the various fascist and neo-fascist groups that exist in the United States and how they morph. I mean, it sounds like a lot of the work you're doing is you must be a regular reader of the Southern Poverty Law Project's press releases, I'm guessing, because
Oh,
there's a
definitely.
lot of crossover there. But I wondered what's your impression? I mean, I know it's early times and hard to know exactly what's happening everywhere unless even if you're actually on the ground. But what is your impression of all the rumors and more than rumors going around about the involvement of all kinds of fascist groups uh, in trying to exacerbate tensions and destabilize things further and whatever like that? I know the Proud Boys have been regularly going around with AR-15s in downtown Portland over the past few days.
Hmm. Hmm. So, just to make sure I fully understand the question, you are just asking what my sense is for the absence or presence of fascists and members of fascist formations in the context of the protest of the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah, in the context of the reaction, the protests that are going on, and what people have been saying, especially in Minneapolis, about all kinds of unmarked vehicles being in neighborhoods and buildings being destroyed that some people suspect were actually destroyed by organized fascist groups that are trying to, you know, uh, to create a race war in their
Right.
own terminology.
Right, right. Again, this is so. I want to say first of all, before I answer the question, that when we're talking about an issue like the murder of George Floyd, something that is so timely, and that even though it's so timely and so current, really taps into centuries old oppressions and intergenerationally inherited traumas. I just wanted to give pause and say that it's sometimes very, very easy for someone who is an individual with a name, and that name gets put next to a question like, are anarchists causing the chaos? It can create this illusion of expertise. I don't pretend to be an expert. I'm just trying to figure this stuff out for myself, and I'm certainly not here to prescribe to specific communities, especially of historically oppressed but nonetheless resilient folks, right? How to behave, what to do, what not to do, how to think. I just want to make that very, very clear.
Yeah,
Um,
sure. Good.
but I will say that I have not seen it personally.
Hmm.
I know that there have been reports from people across the U.S., even in parts of California, where I live, and I think that that threat is something that is very real. We are now hearing reports of individuals who are effectively doxxed by pig departments around the state because they published the arrest logs, and they're now experiencing levels of harassment because of the fact the pigs have doxed them.
Sorry,
We
what is the term? I know that I've heard that young people use this term doxed, but I don't know what it
Sure.
means. What does
Oh,
it mean?
sure. Well, essentially, I'm not as young as perhaps people I am myself, but I will say that yeah, when I initially occurred, right, it was a shorthand term for the expression "dropping documents," which means you find sensitive personal information and you broadcast it. So name, place of residence, workplace. If you're in teaching like I am, sometimes I had colleagues who have had their class schedules published, their office hours published, where their office is, the type of car they drive. They've had pictures of themselves put up online in various chans and things of that nature. So that's effectively what it is, right? It's accessing personal information for the express purpose of harassing or doing something that takes that harassment to an even more severe level an individual. Yeah.
Clay, you were at, I know I'm kind of skipping around here, and I have this tendency because the everything that's happening is a bit overwhelming. It's hard to stay on one subject. But
Yes, it is.
in terms of the spectacle, you were mentioning before we went on that about how that what we are seeing now is sort of many different forms of spectacle, and I want to talk about the spectacle and what that means and what we're experiencing currently in that framework.
Sure, sure. Well, honestly, I said this as well. I kind of hesitate to use that word spectacle just because it can connote, coming out of the sort of philosophical legacy of situationist anarchism. On one hand, a kind of artificial form of participation, a la the fascist spectacle, right? It's large, it's grand, it's empty, but it's really about creating the illusion of some kind of democratic form of participation, right? So the spectacle is kind of typically associated with something that is, to use another term, a kind of simulacra, right? An imitation of imitation, and not quote unquote authentic, or whatever that word might mean. So I think what we're talking about on some level in the streets are new ways of seeing or thinking about the world, right? So that what we're seeing, if we think about the state response and the way in which municipal and other police departments and law enforcement agencies have responded, right, is we are seeing the spectacle of state power. We are seeing the state in its most punitive form arrayed against what I would consider a representation of popular power, right, of people coming into their own power, right, so that we are in these protest spaces and elsewhere. And John Berger talks about this, although as a very, very old left Marxist, he's very, very concerned about policing what kinds of protests are valid and what kinds of protests aren't. And as someone who embraces diversity of tactics, I eschew that. I think that nonetheless, this idea that when we are out, okay, when we are in the streets, when we are with our communities, when we are with our friends, right, we are presenting an alternative way of understanding the world, an alternative way of seeing and being in the world, right, that is in direct opposition to the spectacle of state power.
In terms of the sort of interpretation of the spectacle, or the interpretation of what's happening and how to spin everything, it strikes me that there's something going on that is unusual from my own observation anyway, which is that usually in situations like this, or maybe not it's like this, but in terms of like what they call urban unrest, or major urban disturbances, or whatever you want to call uprisings, riots, whatever term they're using, they usually, the authorities and the media usually pretty quickly sort of come together with an explanation for what's going on. And it seems to me, from my experience, the explanation usually falls into one of two categories. It's either like black people burning down their own neighborhood, what that's one false motif, and then the other one is it's outside agitators that have come in, like, by which they usually mean like young white anarchists from some other city. But these two tropes have been used a lot to describe various events, from the LA uprising to the protests at the free trade area of the Americas in Miami, to any number of other big protests. They say it's outside agitators, or they say it's the locals burning it their own neighborhood, whatever that is supposed to mean, which means different things to different people depending on whether they're homeowners or renters who have been evicted 8 times in the past decade, or but at the moment, the different elements of the authorities and the press are saying both of those things. So it just seems like what they're saying implicitly is this is a sort of a basically a multiracial uprising, or an intersectional uprising, to use a more modern term. But it's not. It's clearly they can't just paint it as outside agitators, or as local people without any popular support, who are just disenfranchised. And you know what I mean? Like what they can't decide, it seems, on their on their line. And I don't know if you've observed this, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I certainly have. I think that, first of all, right, that it's not simply, I think, a question of indecision. I think that there is a way in which the state is hurriedly trying to cobble together some kind of consistent narrative, and so I wouldn't disallow for the fact that we are seeing a little bit of inconsistency, what we might call in the film production, right, continuity issues. Something is not quite right there. But for all of that, I think that these arguments are of a piece, right? So on the one hand, how do we try and explain away people who are effectively giving the violence back? How do we explain away people who have said, I will no longer be content to watch people get murdered. I will no longer watch you terrorize my community. How do we talk about that? And how do we also make sure that the interests of property are more directly preserved, right? So there's almost a way in which, and I'm only thinking about this now, when we're talking about the people in the streets, right, outside agitators, all of that, right, it's about trying to manage, right, what that Trump aide referred to as human labor capital, right? These are not good people. We don't want people to do this. Do not do that. And then, of course, you have the physical property, right? That is being centered in these narratives of people looting and burning down their own neighborhoods and things of that nature. So I think it's trying to sort of maintain that unity between these sort of interests of capital and the levers of exploitation they can pull whenever they like. I will say, and I'm not the first person to say this, and I'm not the only person to say this, thankfully, because who else would listen? If you want to talk about outside agitators, David, coming into a community, let's talk about the pigs. They're the real outside agitators, right?
But of course, it's never described that way. The terminology that's used is always like nobody. You can't come in the interest of solidarity or mutual aid from another town to help people or to be part of a struggle. Then you're automatically an outside agitator. But if you're part of an army that's been called in to invade a country, then you're liberating forces. So it's yeah,
exactly. See, borders. I think we're also talking about borders here, right? Like borders between communities, borders between cities, states, towns, even more metaphorical borders like political issues, right? We know that the ruling class has a vested interest in maintaining the kind of osmotic flow of people, capital, and other resources across these borders. And it's the same thing. It's the same kind of approach to trying to maintain control through isolation and separation.
It seems one of the things you wrote about, like in terms of how different messages are understood and how different messages from sort of neoliberal or bourgeois democracy can be used by fascists so easily, because the messaging is really quite consistent between, like, say, American nationalism and more sort of overtly fascist forms of nationalism. But like one thing I think a lot of people are wondering is how do you know how do you know when you're living in a fascist state? Like, it's not going to look exactly like it did in Germany in 1933 or something, where it's going to look different, right? And we have the prospect now of a major supporter of free trade bills and tech companies, local Senator Ron Wyden, calling Trump a fascist this morning, which is a new thing. They haven't actually been calling him a fascist. They beat around that bush a lot, but
sure.
Calling a major Democratic senator actually calling the president a fascist seems like a interesting step in some direction. I wonder what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, as you can well imagine, David, I don't revere electoral politics, and I certainly don't revere the palace intrigue of either local or national government. Their interests have never been our interests. What passes for the political spectrum on a mainstream level in the U.S. is fundamentally just different shades of right. So I think that we are seeing a kind of forced response, right? But let's not forget, and I'm not saying you're neglecting this and asking the question, but let's remember, right, that this is largely that kind of empty spectacle that I was talking about, right? How people might understand that, right? Oh, well, I'm now going to get on air and say Trump is a fascist. The WAPO had an op-ed this morning that came very close to implying that a government that declares anti-fascism terrorism is a fascist government. But again, these cycles kind of ebb and flow. So I'm not sure if we'll see any real longevity there, but I do think that what we are seeing is the very real-time effect of sustained, unapologetically militant popular struggle. And I think that is, Jeff Shantz has talked about this idea of infrastructures of resistance, right? These kinds of, heydays of like these mass anti-capitalist mobilizations against the forces of capital, right? And I think that we're seeing that type of pressure is still extremely, extremely useful, right?
Yeah. One of the things that strikes me about the sort of movement against Trump specifically that's happened since he's been in office, and that seems to largely sort of characterize itself as a sort of anti-fascist resistance, but with no clear alternative, as far as I can tell. I haven't really participated in this movement much because I'm kind of because I'm an elitist, basically. But I'm waiting for.
You should work on that.
I should work on that. I feel like if when it's I feel more useful participating in efforts that are clearly and consciously distinct from the Democratic Party, and if there's not
Absolutely.
a clear distinction there, then I feel like I'm wasting my time, and I may be wrong about that, because I mean, you got to start somewhere. You got to be able to communicate with people and go to people where they're at, But
Sure.
it strikes me that the Democratic Party is not going to solve our problems, and is actually the reason why we're in the situation we're in, along with the other party.
But most definitely not. Yeah. I mean, I want to clarify. I'm talking about elitism in general. The kind of
of course.
Screw the Democratic Party. Like, you're not elitist. You're saying screw your elitism. I think that's a very different thing. Like, I don't want to watch another beautiful, vibrant social movement die.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly.
I mean, I'm sorry. Like, so what was what you were saying?
So, because how does, I guess the question would be, how does an anti-fascist or how does a resistance movement that is trying to take advantage of the popular antipathy towards Trump, which comes out of really good places, how does that movement distinguish itself from the Democratic Party? Because it seems to me that much of this sort of resistance it's been very vague, very indistinguishable from the Democratic Party, and it's not generally in terms of what you kind of see out there in the media anyway, which not surprisingly, it doesn't seem to be coalescing around any clear alternatives, because it's not like coalescing around rejecting military spending and things like rent control. And I mean, it seems like this is like, I'm talking about a million things at the same time, I know, but like here in Portland, there's so many protests against Trump, and so many protests by people that consider themselves to be anti-fascists who are protesting against Trump. But the reason why Portland has lost more than 50% of its African American population between the last two censuses is because of gentrification, the rise of housing costs, not police brutality. Police brutality is terrible and awful, and is a huge problem here in Portland, and racism and police racism and institutional racism. But it is not institutional racism. Institutional racism prevented people of color from owning property in this state until basically after World War II. But it is not institutional racism that has ethnically cleansed this city. It is gentrification, and it is the cost of housing. And yet, if you try to call a protest against, around, if you're trying to organize around housing issues, the number of, sort of people that you would associate with the anti-Trump protests that come to those protests or any other efforts like that are basically, 5 people or something, So and this disconnect is striking to me, and I wonder what are your thoughts on that?
So the disconnect in particular about sort of the continuity of anti-fascist struggle, or the co-optation of the term, are those the two things you're kind of wondering about in all that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and rather than answering that, because I don't really know how to answer that question, I'd rather just try give your best attempt at it. But it's like all the people who have been, what is I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what there's a lot of discontent and a lot of resistance, but prior to this rebellion going on. I'm talking about prior to last week and prior to the pandemic, which has of course changed things in all kinds of other ways that maybe make this conversation almost a lot less relevant. But it seems like a lot of the folks that are out there in the streets now are many of the same folks who were protesting Trump when he got inaugurated. And I'm just which is great, and it's very impressive, and how many people have been on the streets and all that's going on, and intersectionality of it. But I'm just wondering, in terms of like how people can build this sentiment in a way that doesn't just fall into the trap of party politics.
Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is a very, very solid question, and it's a hard question. It's a big question. And I can remember I was listening to a talk on Sam Ginden's, what was his new book in 2012 on global capitalism, and this very, very old, almost a stereotypical kind of old left communist individual gets up and rails against the panel for refusing to provide either organizational perspectives or programmatic demands. Now, Sam's response was that he's grown very, very skeptical of programmatic demands or organizational responses that are sort of etched in stone, right? And I think that we need to, that is a very, very healthy skepticism, right? We need to be very, very careful about being too prescriptive, right? Mm. That I think is the tension, right? So what are our goals? What do we want? What can we do? These are conversations that I think need to start happening on a much more sort of micro level. But in terms of your question, I'll give you my response, and that is, and this is just Clayton Pyke speaking as Clayton Pyke. While I fundamentally am a platformist, I do see limitations to platformism, and I do see value in affinity group level organizing. And when I talk about platformism, right, for folks who might not necessarily be aware, I'm talking about just the general idea, right, that there needs to be some kind of like anarchist presence in some way. There has to be, and I don't think necessarily, Crime Think, for example, talks about spaces of encounter, right? Those of us who identify in this way, I feel should work to create spaces of encounter, right? Because if I think about, and I'm going to get very anecdotal here, because if I insult myself, I'm not going to get upset, right? I don't want to talk about people, right? I can remember when I first registered to vote and being excited to register to vote, more excited than I was for my first tattoo or my first piercing or my first concert, and if you had told me then that I would be the age I am now and a grumpy, actively organizing anarchist, I probably would have laughed in your face. So like that, it's untenable. What could I possibly do? So I think there is something to be said, right, for people who are perhaps, I don't necessarily want to use the term radicalizing, but are into a shift in their political consciousness, very seismic shifts in their political consciousness, right? It is a process. And for me, and for a number of people with whom I've talked to and with whom I work, there's like a growing sense of disaffection, of disenfranchisement. I can't do this work in these big box 501s. I can't do this work if I'm constantly canvassing for the candidates the Democratic National Committee says I should support, if I'm phone banking. I can't do this work, and it's not really doing anything. What do I do? And that, I think, right, that question, those people who are searching, looking for something that is other than what they've encountered, right? I think there's something really, really vibrant and beautiful and worth thinking about and worth trying to, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, integrate or bring into, the communities of radical activists, anarchists, right, who are doing the work outside of those very, very restrictive kind of moribund structures.
What is places of encounter? So I think that's a very interesting concept, like the idea of the importance of just creating contexts where people from different walks of life and different parts of society and the same neighborhood or whatever can actually communicate and talk about the way forward or organize. It's more about how people organize than having a program. Is that what you're talking
Absolutely.
about? Absolutely.
I think that's actually a pretty solid distillation of one of the points. Absolutely. Absolutely right. It is being consistently present. It is working. And honestly, this non-coercive invitation to engage in the work is such a powerful, powerful thing. Again, in my opinion, right? It's not as if there's some vanguardist org calling itself a party as a part of a larger formation that calls itself international in some kind of farcical way for some kind of reason of smug self-importance, right? To say we are history's chosen. We have the answers. What you need to do is join our party, join our organization, sell our shitty newspaper, whatever, right? Rather than simply saying, hey, we're a group of people who see something happening. We think this is a way of responding to it. If you share that perspective, please come out, right? And then they're already actively doing the work. They're already actively doing that work. And rather than coming with an expectation, everything will be sort of set and all they have to do is fill a specific role, right? They're now more actively recognizing that there are times when we've got to re-strategize. We have to rethink. Not everyone has the answers, right? So they, in trying to come up with those answers as a part of that conversation themselves, become even more drawn into the work. Like it's always already happening with that kind of model, right? Like, what do you mean it won't work? You're already doing it. You're seeing it working. I think there's something really, really powerful about that kind of non-coercive invitation to participate that comes with creating these spaces of encounter.
Interesting. What do you think when we're talking about creating a space of encounter, creating this kind of like venue in a way for people to be able to meet each other and communicate and work together? I wonder, what do you think? And obviously, I'm asking for your opinion here, or your, knowledge based on research, which I guess is another form of opinion. But what do you think in terms of ways to get people ways to attract people to that space of encounter? And I'm kind of thinking this in terms of what you were writing about in your article about the aesthetics of not only fascist groups, but also of any kind of group, and how we communicate, and the importance of visuals, and the importance of maybe art and music and other things like that, which seems to be what you're alluding to when you're talking about, or maybe actually referring to directly when you talk about aesthetics and the design, how much when you're talking in the article, you're focusing a lot about fascist groups, but as we know, like the fascists in Germany in the 30s spent a lot of time on working out the design of the swastika and the flag and the aesthetics, the style. They were really into that, and
they were terrified
like it
of
really
anarchists.
Paid off.
Yeah, they were terrified of anarchists as well. If you see some of the specifically anti-anarchist propaganda coming out of fascist Germany, I mean, these fuckers were terrified. So I think that it says something there, right? That these political machinations, these ideas, these strategies, right, from the other side, materialize on different registers in different ways, and in fashions that are sometimes more distorted or subdued, right? So the rhetoric of anti-anarchism was very much like the rhetoric of the anti-Untermenschen or what have you, right? These people were parasites, they were inferior, all of that, right? But again, right, very prescriptive, very top-down kind of stuff, right? Controlling the narrative. I think that when we're talking about the notion of aesthetics, right, and as I tried to sort of talk about it in my article, right, it's more a sort of theory of different praxes that carry specific kinds of aesthetic dimensions, right? To be present in a space is a kind of aesthetic practice, right? Sticker slaps, banner drops, all of that, right? They're aesthetic practices intended to encourage new ways of seeing, being in the world, and all of that. I think that to get more directly to your question, right, about the spaces of encounter and how it works, honestly, it really begins with this really, really great, in my opinion, this really, really great perspective that kind of distills that really famous quote from Eduardo Galeano about solidarity versus charity, right? But it takes a different direction and says, the most radical position begins with acknowledging that you yourself are not smart and that other people are not dumb, right? So I think that it begins with being in the community and having honest conversations with your friends and your neighbors, right? About what is needed there. What kinds of support are meaningful? Like, where do you see these kinds of pre-existing hierarchical structures deliberately failing or falling short? And what can we do, right? That was one of the most interesting things about this pandemic when it hit, is that government officials were not even responding to phone calls or letters from people I was talking to, right, who tried to write them. 501Cs were basically shuttered. They wanted to do work, but were not sure how to do the work, right? So it's about entering into those spaces, talking about those kinds of gaps and aporias, right? And really trying to involve the broader community, right, in the efforts, right? And then doing the thing. I cannot stress that enough, doing the thing, right? If we think about art collectives like Up Against the Wall Motherfucker or Black Mask, or some of the great work that we've seen coming out of the IWW contemporarily and historically, right? It really is on some level always about participation of the viewer. You are not simply a viewer. You are a participator in creating meaning. You are a participator in creating this alternative form of vision or alternative way of seeing and understanding things, right? So, for example, when folks in Black Mask or Up Against the Wall Motherfucker would go into public spaces, they would have these public performances of art that were totally extemporaneous, and they would encourage audience participation. So it became this kind of impromptu mass artistic expression that was also a very kind of creative way of occupying public space and challenging the strictures and controls of private property. And again, there is no need to read some kind of pamphlet to memorize lines from Lenin or Mao's Little Red Book. You show up, you do the thing, you say fuck the bankers, and you've participated, right? Already, you've had a glimpse of or felt in some way the possibilities of something new and different, right? So these spaces of encounter, I think, are radically participatory and are radically open to encouraging like-minded individuals, or individuals who are somewhat curious, right? In participating in creating this alternative vision to one facet of the world, such as it is. But of course, you want to, of course, take necessary precautions to make sure that you're not exposing yourself to any kind of danger from outside influences, the state and their fascist buddies, for example.
Right. Of course, you're exposing yourself by being out there, and people in many currently and in the past, and depending on the country, have been more or less aware of the possibility that their address or their being out there or their face being out there could get them targeted in some way or another. But I suppose whenever I've thought about security culture in my own personal life, I thought, well, that's kind of a joke because I'm constantly advertising my whereabouts in the form of performances. So, I mean, I've heard about bands that there are bands, in the US and Germany and other countries I've known that where they used to have escape routes for their gigs. Like,
Sure, yeah.
They were attacked. How do you get out of the building?
Absolutely.
But it's it's a good idea, but everybody knows where to find you in the first place, So.
Yeah, right. Well, then you have bands like Moscow Death Brigade, right, who performs in block, and it's an aesthetic choice, right, but it's also a security choice. I mean, they don't want people seeing their faces,
Yeah.
I think that security concerns are important. Those are conversations that are best had with the people you're organizing with, who you can trust. But there are certainly precautions that can be taken, and I'm happy to talk about some of those if you want to take the conversation in that direction.
I think, we can. Let's stick with. I mean, we could, but let's stick with more theoretical stuff. Unless there's people. I mean, I am looking at comments. So if anybody says I really need to know more about what kind of precautions I should take, then I'll ask you. But
and if anybody says what the hell is that guy fucking talking about, please let me know. I'll try and clarify.
Right. Oh man! I mean, I was in Belfast visiting a friend when her face appeared in a loyalist magazine, which basically
Jesus.
means it's like a hit list, basically.
Yeah,
but,
no shit.
You don't know whether you're going to get on. Really somebody's going to come assassinate you, but it's very distressing to have your face published in a fascist magazine. It's not what you want, although your faces generally, many people's faces are fairly easily available and others aren't. And then they, One of the things you wrote about in the article, which I thought was very interesting, is in terms of contemporary fascist and neo-fascist groups in the U.S. as well as other countries, is they're often adopting the kind of language of the left and of progressive social
Sure.
movements. And I often think about, I mean, I think one of the best public speakers I've ever heard is Fred Hampton. I mean, not personally heard him, but heard him in
I was
videos.
like,
You know,
wow, okay.
I was born in '67, so I missed out on Fred Hampton in real
Yeah.
life. But what an incredible thinker and
An
mind
amazing
and
voice.
speaker.
An
What a
amazing
speaker!
voice.
And
Rest in
he,
power, Fred.
yes. And one of the things, one of the quotes I remember, that's been oft repeated, is when he gave this speech where he was talking about like how different communities should organize and what he meant by Black power when he talked about power to the people. And he said Black power to Black people, brown power to brown people, red power to red people, white power to white people. This was in his speech, and I thought, that's very interesting. And you're talking about people need to go and organize in their own communities, however that is defined. And it just seems to me that these fascist groups have basically taken some of the kind of rhetoric that Hampton was talking about and have completely flipped it on its head. And they talk about white identity and European identity and stuff like that. And I wonder if you can talk about that. What is this all about, and what are they trying to do, and why are they adopting this kind of rhetoric? What are they doing with it?
Right. Well, I'm not necessarily sure that I have anything particularly revelatory to say about fascist formations and this co-optation of this progressive or liberal rhetoric on that score, in part because they're for the most part rather clumsy and heavy-handed about it. So the reasons I think are fairly transparent, at least to me. Right. It's about trying to fundamentally drive a wedge into mainstream political discourse, open it up, and insert their position as yet another right perspective that is totally acceptable and that ought to have some kind of voice or representation, right? So I think it's that. I think they've also taken their cues from the way in which neoliberalism, in an attempt to tear down so many of the gains that radical and progressive social movements made in the period following, or I should say before, I went to say following Johnson's Great Society, but before, the sort of watershed moment in the eyes of most historians of the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States, in particular, and Margaret Thatcher in the UK, right? Is that right? It's easier to dismantle it if you make some kind of superficial pretense of being some new form of what is being destroyed, right? That's the neoliberal project, right? And I think that fascism, right, is trying to walk people towards their politics through trying to weaponize these sort of mainstream buzzwords and other aspects of political discourse, right? It's a very, very common recruitment strategy, right? So someone would go to, say, a speaking event with Tomi Lahren, or CSU Fullerton brought Milo Yiannopoulos to campus, right? And it's not really about whether or not those two figures are fascist, but fascists in that audience, right? Having conversations about, oh, what brought you here? Oh, immigration. Yeah, that's a real issue. Have you read this book about the Great Replacement? You know what I mean? Those kinds of things. So they've recognized that, it is much more a war of maneuver, a war of strategy, in terms of how to bring people in to those movements and to try and grow them, right? And to shed some of that more overt fascist imagery.
But like, why does the traditional fascist imagery not appeal to their base as much as some of the more like talking in ways that sound more modern, that have some kind of understanding of like concepts like intersectionality or identity? I mean, they're constantly talking about identity now.
Yes, they are.
But what about why? I mean, like it just strikes me that like as a musician, I have long been struck by the fact that music is oftentimes, it seems to me, undervalued by many radical groups as sort of frivolous, and yet rather than being used as the kind of tool for popular education and community building that it is.
Right.
But of course, music and other forms of art, can be used for lots of different purposes, just like a gun. And
Yes.
of course, the military uses music all the time to build
Yes.
morale, and corporations use it to sell products all the time. But the sort of morale, the military tends to use music to promote nationalism and feelings of superiority, and
Sure.
that why is that not as fashionable now for fascists than the concept of white identity?
Oh, well, I mean, white power record labels have always existed, right? And they will always exist to kind of respond directly to your question about music. And I
Mm.
think if you look at, the content of some of the chants, subreddits, things of that nature, even certain of these fascist formations, right? They do, as odd as it might sound, array themselves along a spectrum, right? And so they are actually trying to, soften some of that imagery. So, for example, as I mentioned in the article, right, they will use like the 13 stars in the original U.S. flag with the fasces in the center as opposed to the swastika. So it's not that they themselves are averse to this imagery, right? But this is not, or at least for some of these people, the idea is this should not be the first thing that people encounter, precisely because of the way in which our side has been able to dominate that narrative and push fascism out of the public view in so many ways. It's an ongoing struggle, but it's still happening. So I think we should take credit for the success. But again, it's arrayed along a spectrum. You might not start with a suggestion to read Mein Kampf or a suggestion to read Siege or the Turner Diaries or what have you, right? But that is always there, and it's
Right.
a question of moving you towards that ultimate fascist destination point, if you will, by degrees.
Someone in Oklahoma is wondering on Facebook what your thoughts are about Trump sending, or is he just, I think, at this point, proposing to send the military to stop protests in the states? And I'm I'm also I'm kind of like curious about your thoughts on this, because like one thing that I heard Juan Gonzalez say this morning when he was comparing the extent of the number of arrests, the number of people killed, the number of buildings destroyed in the LA uprising in 1992, like there were 12,000 arrests, $1 billion worth of property damage. It was way more than what's going on now. Although what's happening now is more dispersed and more national than that uprising was, I believe. But now they're talking about calling in the army, and that seems once again to be all about the communication and the spectacle more than actual practical stuff. I don't know. What do you think about this calling in the army now?
Well, I think that, I mean, first of all, the National Guard has already been deployed to various parts of the country in a direct response to the global health crisis. So I think it's important to note that the state already has a kind of toehold in a number of communities. But that being said, while I am inclined to think that this is that kind of posturing that we've seen from Trump before, right, we ought not to dismiss the possibility of a very real threat there. And I do not intend to be alarmist. I am not trying to encourage people to build shelters or anything of that sort. I mean, do what you think it makes sense for you to do to be safe and to make sure your friends in your community are safe. But that being said, I think that it is something that we need to be attentive to, because, and again, this is one of those statements that's so macro level, it almost loses its import because it's so decontextualized from specific events in a specific locale on the ground. I will say nonetheless that one of the lessons that I think radical memory or radical history carries forward is that at some point, movements get to a scale where, whether or not they've considered it before that point, they have to think about how to contend with violently oppressive state power.
Mm-hmm.
Very massive scale. And that's not to say that what we're seeing in Santa Ana and what we're seeing in Anaheim and what we're seeing in LA and what we're seeing in Portland and elsewhere isn't already on a very significant scale, right? But I think we need to think about the politics of escalation in the context of this struggle, because I do think that, at least for me, and this is purely my opinion, there has been a very clear kind of, I don't want to go as cliche as calling it a tug of war, but there's been a struggle over assertion of power, right? Where one action called for in the evening is extremely militant, right? And police are forced to flee or to hide or to regroup and try and do snatch and grabs as opposed to some kind of sort of massively coordinated kettle, right? And so then the action the next day, right, becomes more about the police trying to assert their control over this situation to compensate for the lack of control they had at a previous action, right? And of course, the popular response in part is we show up in more numbers, we show up readier for whatever tactics that the police might use to escalate. And let's be real, as Christian Williams says in Our Enemies in Blue, it's really more accurate to talk about these things as police riots, okay? These are popular uprisings. What you're seeing are police riots, okay?
Yeah.
Right? Is acknowledging that this is a longer game, and it really is about fighting for power. I'm not necessarily certain that I'm comfortable saying we're starting to see like a really strong dual power network develop, but I personally feel like you bring up the LA uprising, and I haven't studied that too significantly or seriously, but I do feel like, as you said, the scale, the level of adaptability on the ground, as well as the level of strategizing that, in my view, has to have taken place for so many of these actions to be as successful as they were, coupled with other factors, right, speaks to the fact that something different is happening. And honestly, this timeline continues to be so bizarre and so surreal and so uncomfortable. I'm not really uncomfortable myself denouncing or discounting anything.
I know what you mean. Like, it's hard to even talk about anything that's happening. Like really since March, because everything changes not only by the day, but by the hour. And so it just, it's hard to, say anything definitive, because in the next hour, you might be contradicted by a new dramatic development. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I think, now that you brought that up, David, I think it's interesting as well, because we're talking about, ways of seeing, ways of thinking. It's not just what's visually present, right? The photographs of people running through the streets, celebrating their power, coming into their power for the first time, right? But it's also, right, this, I would say, the deliberate spread of conflicting or confusing disinformation, right? Different kinds of stories that make it more difficult for people to interact. There is a reason why the news cycle is as spotty as it is, right?
Yeah.
It's about controlling access to information, right? Because that's still one way that they can maintain control over the narrative. So it's our responsibility, and people are already doing this, these wonderful live streams of Unicorn Riot, just random people in the streets on their social media as well, right, are really doing a fantastic job of countering that narrative, right, and trying to solidify a response. And I think that's a really, really beautiful thing and an important part of the work, and a great way for folks to get involved who might be wondering how they can do so if they're a little uncomfortable being in the streets.
Yeah, because I mean, to my thinking, it's hard to overemphasize the power of an idea when people understand something that's happening. Like, I mean, you can see how the media is really trying to coalesce around the idea that there's this phenomenon called peaceful protest, and then there's this phenomenon called violent protest. And basically, if you're not standing around with a sign, you're not a peaceful protester, right? Or if you raise your hand in defense against a billy club that's coming down on your head, you're a violent protester. So it's this dichotomy they're trying to communicate so constantly. It seems like they understand that embracing this idea of the myth between peaceful and violent protest is very important for us to understand in their minds. And I think conversely, there are very important ideas that need to be communicated so that people understand what's really happening.
Oh, most assuredly. Yeah, most assuredly. I mean, that is another one of those sort of old patterns of seeing, old patterns of thinking. And we were talking a bit about borders, real and physical, or imagined and conceptual, and that, I think, is another really, really crucial conceptual border, right? That I think it's important to acknowledge. And again, I'm not saying that I don't understand the frustration with AB protests. I very, very much do, right? But it's important to recognize that for many people, radicalization is a journey. I'm still on that journey, right? I would like to think I'm not arrived at a terminus yet, So having, again, that diversity of methods in play and respected, I think, is useful. What they don't want to talk about is they don't want to talk about the St. Paul principles. They don't want to talk about red and green zones during WTO protests. They don't want to talk about strategic coordination, right, in the amplification of specific demands or goals through different tactics. Okay, so I think it's important. And other people are already doing this. I'm very, very happy to see it in the public discourse again, right, to again, break down that border, challenge that border. Are they distinct forms of protest? Well, they're different, but how different are they really? And how can we understand how they might work symbiotically?
Yeah.
Which certainly wouldn't be the case in all cases for every protest, right? I would not be a part of any action where I see protesters voluntarily create a human chain to protect police, for example. But that is just me.
Mm-hmm.
Speak for myself.
Clayton J. Pyke, we've reached the end of the hour somehow, and I still want to talk about another hour's worth of stuff, but we'll just have to get you back on here. And thanks so much for joining us for the discussion.
Well, thank you for having me. It was really fantastic. I sincerely hope that I made some kind of sense and that folks who are listening were able to find some things useful in my remarks, if nothing else, something to argue about with their friends.
Yeah, I think you made a lot of sense. It's the only problem is it was only an hour's worth of sense, and there's still a whole lot more unpacking that we need to do here. But
well, something about weeks where decades happen and decades where nothing happens. Blah blah blah. I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah, feels like it's about a decade per week. Yeah.
Oh, amen, God.
Thank you, Clay. See you around.
Thank you. Appreciate it, David. Have a good day.
You too. And thanks everyone out there for listening to this edition of Fifth Estate Live. You can find these and my other live stream broadcasts all together in the Discussions with David playlists on the YouTube and on SoundCloud and in podcast form if you look for This Week with David Rovics wherever you get your podcasts. To support the Fifth Estate, please go to fifthestate.org and subscribe to the print edition, or donate to the Fifth Estate and help us continue to send lots of magazines to prisoners who generally have zero access to the internet. To support my ongoing live streaming, podcasting, and recording projects, if you can, please consider joining my community-supported art program at davidrovics.com/subscribe or at patreon.com/davidrovics. Members of my CSA not only make it possible for me to do what I do, but they also get access to various exclusive offerings, such as my 16-episode audio memoir. Tomorrow, I'll be talking with my old friend, Vermont-based author, activist, and educator Brian Tokar. Hope to see you again soon in cyberspace and in the streets. Remember, don't pay the rent and don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through.